the largest and the bloodiest confrontation of World War II, a battle that took half a year and had nearly 2 million casualties on both sides, losing a population the size of a small country. So, without further ado, let's talk about the Battle of Stalingrad. The assault on the city was a part of the German campaign known as Case Blue. During Operation Barbarossa, the main campaign intended to knock out the Soviets out of the war, the Germans had tremendous success in the invasion, but it all came to a halt in the winter between 1941 to 1942 with the Battle of Moscow. Stuck, Hitler searched for an offensive solution, and for this, he needed oil, which Germany was already heavily pressed on. The High Command developed a plan to capture the oil resources of the Caucasus region, which was the main goal of the newly updated operation. However, the reason for the Battle of Stalingrad also included multiple goals, which were not exactly critical to the overall war effort, which eventually led to the defeat of the German army. First was the Persian Corridor, which was a supply route from Iran to the Soviet Union, in which the British and the Americans provided land-lease equipment to the Soviets. Capturing Stalingrad, which was situated on the bank of the Volga River, would make the delivery much more difficult and would stop overall river traffic. Another very important reason was propaganda, as today's Volgograd bore the name of the Soviet leader, Stalin. Hitler saw the capture of this city as a very big hit to the morale of the Soviet people, which is also why Stalin sought to hold on to the city to the last man. On the 23rd of August, 1942, the German 6th Army, containing the finest troops, reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. Soviets, expecting the attack, sent the grain, cattle and railway cars across the Volga, but not much of the city's population was evacuated, which led to the shortage of food. Stalin's justification for not evacuating the people was so that the army would fight harder, knowing that civilians are present. The battle began with heavy bombing. Over 1,000 tons in 48 hours of bombs was dropped onto the city, which was more than in London at the height of the Blitz. Germans advanced into Stalingrad, but the bombing was so devastating that it essentially turned the city into rubble, making it very hard for tanks and troops to push in. This led to bloody close quarters combat, which was one of the worst in the history of the world. Most of the civilians weren't evacuated, and the ones that weren't killed were set to build trenches and fortifications. Germans maintained air superiority for most of the battle, and tanks were literally being made and sent into the battlefield unfinished right until the Germans burst into the factory. As the Soviet High Command had previously issued Order 227, infamously known as "Not one step back," there was no retreat at Stalingrad. The 62nd Army, under the command of Vasily Chuikov, made a determined stand. At the same time, the German army was constantly pumping troops into the city, which started to strain their flanks. Soon, the Soviets only held a small strip of the city at the bank of the Volga, and the only way to resupply had been through the river. This was very hard for the Soviet troops, as due to the air superiority and the constant raids on their transport, very little got through. It had gotten so bad for the Soviets that the German machine guns actually shot at the supply convoys, being so close to the river. At this point, the battle was one of the worst of the entire war across all of the theaters. The Germans had to take the city room by room, building by building, and stair by stair. Hand-to-hand combat, hidden snipers were an all too common occurrence. Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet sniper, had built his reputation in Stalingrad, having killed 255 enemy soldiers, including 11 snipers. The turning point was Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive with the goal of encircling the Axis forces. It caught the German army by complete surprise, as they hadn't expected such a large offensive from the Soviets that were seemingly on the verge of defeat. With two spearheads, it was a deep penetration maneuver intended to break the flanks. As these flanks consisted mainly of the undermotivated and overstretched Romanian, Hungarian and Italian troops, they were easily broken. By November 23, 1942, the encirclement of the bulk of the German army was complete. The high command urged Hitler to allow the army to break out, but he wouldn't even consider retreating from Stalingrad. Instead, he would intend to supply the army through air convoys. This would prove completely disastrous, having lost much of the supplies and the Luftwaffe machinery. In December of 1942, Erich von Manstein formed an army to break the encirclement, but at the same time, Hitler forbade Friedrich Paulus, the general of the 6th Army, to fight his way towards Manstein. As the newly formed army lacked the power to break the massive Soviet defense and the harsh Russian winter started to set in, the entire Operation Winter Storm was a complete disaster. In turn, Soviets would start Operation Little Saturn, continuing the offensive, shrinking the circled Axis forces. Hitler was so keen on holding onto the city that he promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, attempting to entice him to not surrender. However, as the situation was so hopeless, in January 31st, 22 generals along with Friedrich had surrendered, and on February 2nd, the rest of the Axis forces were captured. The battle for Stalingrad had ended, but at a great cost, with the casualties in the millions and the entire city in rubble. Only a few thousand of the captured Germans ever returned home, and Stalingrad was awarded the title of a hero city, having been rebuilt and later having its name changed to Volgograd. A colossal monument was constructed in 1967 known as the Motherland Calls, Rodina Mать Зовёт in Russian, on Mamayev Kurgan. To this day, it is remembered as the most brutal and the bloodiest battle in all of human history. Considered as one of the biggest turning points in World War II, this is the history of the Battle of Stalingrad. Thank you for watching. Make sure to check out our science video on stress and subscribe to stay up to date with the newest content. See you next time.